U.S. enters war and Spanish flu score. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is March 4th, 2021. And on this date in history, for about 150 years of U.S. history until 1937, this is the date of inauguration when new presidents would take office. The biggest problem that they had was the fact that uh, it was 4 months between the time a president was elected and took office. And as a result, people lost patience, and things like the Civil War started because 7 states seceded. You had things like uh, during FDR's inauguration, people were terrified he was going to take the United States off the gold standard, so thousands of banks closed as a result. So imagine what would have happened this year had things been like that. So the war's still going in full steam. Okay, and this is the year of lose an ally, win an ally. The Russians withdrew from World War One following the Bolshevik Revolution and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. On a really bad note for the English and the French, this freed up 2 million German soldiers to come and fight. And what made things even worse is the fighting was nothing like the fighting on the Western Front and the East. In fact, these were well rested, well trained, ready to go soldiers. So, luckily for the Allies, uh, at the same time, Arthur Zimmerman, who was a diplomat to the United States from Germany, sends a communique to his brother, who was the diplomat from Germany to Mexico, and the British took hold of this, and they actually translated and showed that the Germans had proposed that if Mexico helped them win the World War One, that Mexico would get all of its land back from the United States. The United States gets really upset. We declare war, and we're officially in World War One. Many people still believe that the British intelligence made up this entire thing to get the U.S. involved in the war. And with the propaganda machine that they had, it was really credible that they might have been able to pull off something like this. So now the U.S. is in the war. So it took the U.S. nearly a year to get its forces over to Europe. The British and French were infuriated by the Americans and called them fake allies. The truth is, the Americans did not want American troops being under the same conditions as the French and British just going in. And the British and French said, just send your troops over and we'll train them and we'll get them ready for what they needed to do. But we decided not to. So once the U.S. forces get there, they make a major difference to begin with. In March of 1918, U.S. troops captured Cantigny, and with help from France, actually will save Paris from a German attack. Now, General John J. Pershing, who was the U.S. General of the Army, the highest rank, basically a 6-star general, he was told by Wilson, the only thing I want from you is to keep a separate army. Don't become part of what France and Britain are doing. So they plan and they stage the most massive attack in U.S. history to this day, bigger than anything we did in World War One. And this is the Battle of Argonne Forest. And in this attack, well over 1 million men were involved. 120,000 of them would become casualties. The majority of them also 120,000 men in the battle, and about 70,000 of them due to illness, like the Spanish flu, which they wouldn't really know for about a year exactly what was taking everyone down. And from this point, German position after German position began to fall. Now the truth is, no matter how well we were doing, we never got close to Germany. The Germans the Germans never had any Allied troops set foot on their soil unless they were POWs. By the way, U.S. troops were really prone to gas attacks for a couple reasons. One, they'd never experienced them before, but two, there was a big problem in World War One with war profiteers, where they would make airplanes and put in radio, but not put all the radio parts they need, so the radios didn't work, and many times they weren't able to get back information before they were shot down. Some guns were made with inferior supplies, and the shells might explode and blow the hands off of our soldiers. Gas masks, tens of thousands of them were sent over without the filters to protect them from the poisonous gases being used on the front lines. So a lot of casualties were the result of wealthy American businesses that were building substandard products. So the Second Battle of the Marne. So this is whenever where Germans are going to push for their last attempt to take Paris. So starting in March of 1918, 140,000 fresh U.S. troops are going to make the difference here. Ludendorff realized that the war was over and pushed the German government to sue for peace. And Wilhelm is going to step down. Wilhelm II is going to step down. Now, this is not a surrender, but this is a push for peace negotiations, and both sides were really ready for this. So the Great War in numbers. So there were 65 million troops that were mobilized in total, and out of them, 40 million were casualties. And if you remember, casualties means dead or wounded. There were 7 German armies that invaded France in 1914 alone. There were 12 pilots that became aces that had shot down 50 planes by themselves. The German flamethrower at the beginning of the war had a range of 35 yards where it could roast someone alive from 35 yards away. By the end of the war, the Americans had a flamethrower that could go over 100 yards. 2,600 Allied ships were sunk by German U-boats. These are not military ships, but just shipping. There were over 500,000 British that were killed, whose bodies or traces of their bodies were never found. Due to the shelling, it really gets rid of all trace and existence of anything that you can bury or identify. There were 8,300,000 combatants that were killed in all nations. And what's worse is when they come home, what they're all carrying. And I believe we'll get to that on the last slide, but just in case you're curious, it's the Spanish flu that 20% of the world gets infected as a result. 1 out of every 5 people on Earth got the Spanish flu. So, the armistice or ceasefire was signed on November 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. And the Kaiser was forced to step down as a part of this. This armistice was not a surrender by the U.S. troops, the German troops, or anyone else. This just meant that they all had agreed to stop fighting. A group of Americans broke through the German lines and were coming up and found themselves right in the sights of a machine gun outpost. The Americans froze and looked up at the man. The man looked back at them. They asked, "Why are you not shooting or trying to kill us?" And he said, "The war ends in 15 minutes. No need for anyone else to die." So the peace talks come. Now, you would think that as a result of the force shown by Germany, that Germany would be at the tables to talk about what happened afterwards. In fact, the strongest nations still standing really were the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. But we decided to keep Germany out of the peace talks. And honestly, if nothing else, this leads to World War II. So you have the big four. Now, in charge of France was Clemenceau. Okay, and Clemenceau wanted to keep Germany from invading France again, so they were going to put up things to keep that from happening. They wanted Germany to pay for reparations or war damages in northern France. They wanted to destroy the German military and economy. France wanted nothing but revenge. Britain. The British public was anti-German, but they needed Germany to trade with, and also, just in case there was a war with the Soviet Union, they needed Germany's industrial might to help fight them. Wilson was concerned about building a legacy for himself, and so he has what's called the 14 points. Now, a lot of these were great, and if you could maintain these, they would have kept a lot of problems out, but one thing I should probably mention before I move on is, according to the Constitution, Congress, the Senate and Congress, will negotiate all treaties and sign all treaties. So it doesn't really matter what the president does. The president is a figurehead, but not someone who can negotiate these things for themselves. So he's pushing for open diplomacy and no secret agreements. So things like the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance would happen again. He wanted self-determination, or the ability for nations to create their own countries. He wanted freedom of the seas so that shipping would not be attacked, which is one of the major reasons that the U.S. gets involved in the war. And he wanted the League of Nations, a peacekeeping group to prevent wars. The problem is, with a peacekeeping group, someone has to be the police force and send in troops that would go and fight and die in other countries. Americans didn't want this. The Republicans didn't want this. So as a result, the U.S. would never sign off on the Treaty of Versailles, and one of the major reasons that World War II will happen. In Italy, Vittorio Orlando, as soon as he found out that Italy wasn't going to get anything out of it as far as land, he walks out of the negotiations and causes just another problem. So, the Treaty of Versailles, the agreement that was finally agreed upon, this ends the war, and they accepted most of Wilson's 14 points. Germany loses land and has to pay reparations to all of the Allies. And things are about to look even worse for Germany. So, Germany has to accept responsibility for all the loss and all the damage in the war guilt clause. So everything that happened in World War I is blamed on them, and as a result, they're going to pay the biggest penalty. The truth was, the first nation to declare war was Austria. And they declared war on a nation that wasn't even a nation, in Serbia. Then the Russians declared war on Austria. And that's where everything falls apart. It wasn't Germany, but Germany's going to get all the blame. So because of this, part one, Germany loses their navy. All their submarines were beached, and all their major ships were sunk. Germany loses their air force. The army was reduced down to 100,000 men. They were banned from ever uniting with Austria. They couldn't have any troops in the Rhineland. That's on the right-hand side, the red part of the map at the top. They lost land to France, even though no one set foot on German soil. And they had to pay heavy reparations or war damages. So much money did they have to pay that they didn't pay everything off until 2012. So that was 93 years that they were paying on that. Not counting World War II, of course. So, this is what they do to Germany. So why would Germany sign off on this when they had the most powerful military in the world? Well, they were negotiating under the belief that it was in good faith. And so the British kept the blockade in place and cut off all food to Germany. Germany had really lost the ability to make food at this point, and ship it out to people. So they starved about 1 million people to death, the British did, in Germany, until they agreed to accept the Treaty of Versailles. So this was forced upon a group of people. The Weimar Republic is going to replace the German monarchy after World War I, and it was not really supported by the people and forced on the people. So whenever Hitler overthrows it, there was not a lot of difficulty in this, because it was really set up to be easily overthrown. So, revolutions that were going on in Germany at this point. The German independent socialists were trying to push for a social revolution. It was led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, and they formed the German Communist Party. Now, ending the war is going to hurt the growth of this party, and Frederick Ebert is actually going to use his army to put down this group of rebels. So there was an attempt to try and form a communist party, which terrified most of Europe if you have the Soviet Union and Germany both becoming communist parties. Once the war is over, Austria-Hungary is going to be replaced by Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. So they split it up into several different nations. So, as you can see here, the territorial gains that Germany made were used to help create Poland, and you had East Prussia and Germany. So, two separate nations. We're going to split up all the Germans. Austria-Hungary was split up into Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania, and Bulgaria were also created during this time. All just kind of a slap in the face to Austria-Hungary and to Germany. They also decided to divide the Ottoman Empire up into Turkey, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Transjordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the Aden Protectorates, Muscat and Oman, and the Trucial States. And so these were mainly controlled by Britain and France, causing problems with this region of the world with Europe. And the U.S. would help support and protect all of this as well. John Maynard Keynes, a famous economist who will come up with very important policies, he attended the negotiations and predicted in his book, The Economic Consequences of Peace, that peace would destroy the world economy. And ultimately, the Treaty of Versailles would fail because of isolationism by the U.S. and Soviet Union. So they didn't have all the support they needed to make the treaty work. Finally, one of the last major problems that happened as a result of the war is the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu actually started in the United States and spread to Europe during the war, and as everyone's evacuating going home, they carry home strands of it. About 100 million people died as a result of the Spanish flu, or 1 out of every 17 people on Earth. In today's number, that would be about 700 million people would die under the same numbers that died during the Spanish flu. It infected 20% of the Earth, and the people that it attacked the most were between the ages of 13 and 39. So wiped out a large amount of the generation that had survived World War I. Now, as the war is closing, in the Ottoman Empire, the Turks decided that it was time to wipe out the Armenians. And this began really the first genocide of the 20th century. By the way, if you're wondering what's in the background, that is my dog George chewing away at one of his toys. We feed him, I promise, but he likes to go crazy on his stuff. Anyway, uh, they feared the Turks feared that the Christian minority of Armenians might help Russia during the war, so they began to kill off the Armenian population. They reduced it during the war, and this is a civilian population, not a military population. They went from 2,133,190 to 387,800 over an 8-year period. Many of them were marched to death. Many of them were taken to large mass graves, shot, and then buried in mass. So there were several different genocides that took place in the 20th century. We mainly talk about the genocide of the Jews, but that, part of those numbers would also include Soviet soldiers, the Polish, Gypsies. In the 1990s, you have the genocide in Kosovo and in Serbia, and in addition, you also have a genocide taking place in Darfur. So there was no shortage of, and in Rwanda, so no shortage of genocides in the 20th century. This brings us to the end of this unit and another day. Please don't cocaine, please don't AIDS, and please don't COVID. And if you see anyone doing that, go tell an adult that they shouldn't be, and wash your hands. I'll see you on the other side. Be safe, but don't be a safe.